Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel, and I'm going to push some buttons and piss people off because I like to do that. But I don't enjoy doing it, I just do it because I like to see the things that y'all don't see and the issues that you aren't aware of. And today I'm talking about retro collecting, and the question is it bad? Now, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about video games because that's what people think of. They think of retro video game collecting. But I'm also going to talk about toys and other things because I have noticed some observations in regards to collectors and collector culture and how it has and had an impact on other aspects of our lives that were maybe unintended consequences of our actions. So, let's start with retro video game collecting. Now, I'm going to throw this out there, and if you disagree with me, I don't give a fuck. I'm not going to call you an idiot. I'm just going to say I don't care if you disagree with me. Retro is PlayStation 1, 1995, backwards. Everything newer is modern. That's the divide. Because that's when we went from primitive games to semi-modern games. PlayStation is the barrier. Alright? So when I say retro, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not just talking about used video game collecting because that's separate. That's it. It doesn't matter your definition of retro. Used video game collecting and retro video game collecting are two different hobbies, and they have different impacts on the world. And I'm going to talk about retro collecting specifically because that has had more of an impact on our society than just used video games. Because there's always been used video games, even when the retro games we're talking about were current gen, brand new product. Okay? So they're two different things. Retro collecting refers to recreating a time period. That's what it is. It's literally all about recreating a specific point in time. The late 70s, the mid 80s, the early 90s, etc. The goal in retro collecting is essentially to relive your childhood. Now, yes, I know, pinkies up, you could argue everybody has a childhood. Yes, I know that. But the word retro, and I know that the definitions of words do and can change, and I know the word definition as it's currently used, retro, is being misused by people that I disagree with in their misuse, but we'll get to that in another video. But very specifically, when we're talking about retro culture, even within video games, we are very decidedly talking about 80s culture. This is not ambiguous. What are the popular video games people collect? Like, collectors collect. NES, Super NES, Sega Genesis, N64, Sony PlayStation. Now, within that, you have other people, weirdos, myself included, yes, I'm a weirdo, I'll admit it, who collect other things like Ataris, and Coleco, and 3DO, and CDI, and TurboGrafx, and weird shit like that. Even Sega Saturn, those weirdos. Yes, if you have a Sega Saturn, I'm sorry, you're a weirdo. Just get a goddamn PlayStation and a 32X and you're good. Why? Never mind. I'm over it. Anyways, but neither here nor there. But it isn't just the specific video games, retro collectors, and I'm talking about young kids, Gen Z, Gen Y, etc., who focus on. It isn't just Nintendo cartridges and Nintendo machines and discs that people collect, although Nintendo discs is more modern, that would be GameCube on, but it is what it is. They also collect t-shirts with retro video game characters on them, or throwbacks. The NES controller on a t-shirt that says something like The Birth of Gaming or something like that. Some kind of smug little comment. A picture of Freddy Krueger, a t-shirt with, Ferris Bueller, I guess. I don't know. Whatever. Or old computers from the 80s, the Commodore 64 being the most popular for some reason. And no, it's not the best-selling computer of all time, and I can prove that with actual facts, but I'm not going to get into it because people really bend over backwards to change the definition of a computer to make the Commodore 64 the best-selling computer of all time, and I'm not here to argue with those idiots. I'm just going to tell you, you are wrong, and one of these days I will prove it, but I'm not going to do it today, and do not come at me in the comments, because I'm just going to remove your comment or remove you from my channel. So don't even try. Don't even bother. Because to me, you are on the same level of stupidity as a flat earther, and I will not associate with flat earthers. So if you're a flat earther, and you think Commodore 64 was the best-selling computer of all time, goodbye. Anyways, yeah, it was a very popular system at the time, but it wasn't a standard. There is no standard Commodore 64. There were different models. They don't all count as the same thing. Just like there are different models of Pentium 3 computers. Doesn't matter if that Pentium 3 comes in an HP shell or a compact shell, it's still a Pentium 3. Okay? So let's nip that in the bud, idiots. Commodore fanboys, fangirls, cheerleaders, they give me a fucking headache. They're worse than Atari fans. They're worse than Sega. They're worse than Nintendo fans. And no, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with Commodore. It's a great product line. I'm just, you know what I'm saying? I'm just dispelling myths and pissing people off at the same time because, you know, people hold on to their myths because they don't like to realize that they have gaps in their knowledge brain. But anyways, retro collecting is also collecting VHS cassettes of movies from the 80s for some reason. Labyrinth, The Blues Brothers, Karate Kid, etc., for whatever reason. Some take it a step further and also, or in addition to, or instead of, collect those same films on Laserdisc. And there's an even smaller subset of weirdos out there, myself included, that even go so far as to buy movies on Betamax. And this is all relevant to my topic, because the point is it isn't just video games, and this is going to be evidence that supports that my claim that the retro culture is really just 80s culture. And look, I'm not dismissing your childhood if you're like 19 years old right now and the game console you had as a kid was, I don't know, a PS3 or a Wii U. I'm not dismissing that. But what I'm saying is that's not the collector culture. That isn't it. Video game, like collecting video games like as a whole, video games is a separate hobby from what I'm talking about. It is nuanced, and yes, there is overlap. I'll admit that. We'll address that. But I have to be very specific, and I'm not just saying retro is 95 backwards for a reason. I'm not just being dismissive of your views that retro is old. I'm talking about retro collecting as a thing, as a concept. Now, obviously, every generation of consumers who have been raised in capitalist culture have always tried to buy back the things from their childhood. That has been going on since the beginning of capitalism and consumer culture. So that's not unique to us, and that's not unique to y'all either. But it's worth mentioning that there's a difference between collecting, figurines from your childhood versus buying everything that you can get your hands on from your childhood. And yeah, I will specifically say that there are vintage, and vintage is a different word than retro, collectors who specifically try to recreate the 50s or the 60s. Because that's what they grew up with. There obviously were no video games to speak of in the 50s or the 60s. So they're collecting things like Coke cans and, gas station signs and movie posters and action figures and, Hot Wheels or Barbies and Legos and whatever they did have when they were kids, because I wasn't a kid in the 50s or 60s, and neither were you, presumably, I would assume. Anyone who was old enough to be alive, a kid in the 50s or 60s, isn't watching my videos. I would make that assumption. I look at the analytics. I know who my audience is. And I know, yes, Gen Y, Gen Z, the youngins, Gen Alpha? I don't know. I don't understand the naming of generations. Y'all are going to recreate your childhoods when you get to be my age and in between your 20s to up. You're going to, because that's what we do as humans who live in capitalist societies, because we're consumers. We're brainwashed from birth that buying things will make us happy. They don't, but we're told that. And this is where I'm going with this. But I'm specifically focusing on the 80s culture for a reason. Because I know PS2... Oh, okay, I'll give you an example. People, and when I say people, I'm talking about those of us in this collector mentality, are so obsessed with the 80s. So obsessed with the 80s. Everything that is current today was originated or made popular in the 80s. And I say originated or made popular because I know X-Men and superhero comic books existed before the 80s, but comic books as like a thing, comic book culture, sci-fi movies based on comic books, cartoons on Saturday morning based on comic book characters, action figure toy lines all over the place featuring comic book characters, really became ultra popular in the 80s. And then continued on from there. But what are our current toy lines? DC Superpowers, Marvel, Toy Biz, Legends, or whatever. All they're trying to do is recreate the toys from the 80s. Transformers is a prime example, no pun intended, of this phenomenon. Transformers used to evolve. Every generation, we would get a new cartoon with entirely new designs and entirely new cast of characters for Transformers. Sometimes Bludgeon would be a main character. Other times, Blitzwing would be a main character. Other times, Black Arachnia would be a main character. Every new Transformers toy line, we got new characters. We got X-Brawn in one of them. You got a different character named Blur in another one. And so on and so forth. Barricade. But at some point, when collecting culture as a whole became mainstream, toy companies, and in particular Hasbro, realized that people don't want new Transformers. They want new toys reminiscent of the original Transformers, and specifically the 84 cast. We have become obsessed to an unhealthy degree with the original 1984-1985 Transformers from Generation 1. Obsessed. Optimus Prime has to be a flat-nosed pickup semi-truck with a gray trailer. He has to be red and blue. Any other Transformers design of Optimus Prime, we thoroughly reject. I disagree with this. One of my favorite Optimus Prime action figures is from 2001 Car Robots in Disguise, the Fire Truck. Because it was different. I want different. There was a time where people wanted different, but not anymore. Now, all we're trying to do is just try to tweak that original Generation 1 Optimus Prime, every new toy, to see how many things we can change about it without changing too much, so that we can keep it as close to the authentic original as we can. We're obsessed with the 80s. I've done tons of videos on this. We're obsessed with the 80s. This does also translate over to video games. Yes, I know Nintendo franchises were popular outside the 80s. And some of their more modern franchises like Splatoon and Smash Brothers have very little surface level connection to the 80s, Animal Crossing. But they're still popular. Yes, I recognize that. But their most popular, most successful franchises come from the 80s. Mario, Zelda, Donkey Kong, Kirby. This is where they make their money. Pokemon, but they don't own nor did they originate Pokemon, so that's a separate thing. That's a whole nother video for a whole nother day. You might not know this. But Nintendo does not own the Pokemon company. That Pokemon is not a Nintendo product. It is a product that Nintendo partners with 2 other companies to produce. So, theoretically, they could put Pokemon on PlayStation and PC if they wanted to. They just choose not to because they don't want to piss off Nintendo, because it is what it is. But that's neither here nor there. Because a lot of people think Pokemon, they associate it with Nintendo for reasons. But here's the thing. It isn't just Mario that people are obsessed with. It's 8-bit Mario from the NES people are obsessed with. To the point that some of the best-selling games on the Wii U, and were carried over to the Switch, were NES Remix, NES Remix 2, and Super Mario Maker, and Super Mario Maker 2. They did eventually incorporate, by way of DLC and other updates, assets from the new Super Mario series and the Super Mario World series going forward. But initially, they were just trying to recreate those 3 8-bit NES games. And those were the games, if you play NES Remix, those are the levels people are making. Most people are either using Super Mario Bros. 3 as a template, or the original Super Mario Bros. As a template, borrowing from other games. Very rarely do you see somebody using assets from Super Mario Bros. 2 or World or New. It's almost always 1 or 3. Because in our collective gamer, retro, 80s obsessed culture, we associate Mario and Nintendo with those 2 games. For a good reason. Super Mario Brothers, because that was the one that introduced Mario and Nintendo to the world and made them mega popular at the time. And Super Mario Bros. 3, because that was the best in the franchise for the longest time, probably still is to some people. And that was the one that cemented Mario as a legitimate phenomenon. We got cartoons and toys and comic books and live-action movies following and in relation to Super Mario Bros. 3. Although we had some hints at some of that prior to Super Mario Bros. 3, it really became a phenomenon, starting with The Wizard introducing us to the movie The Wizard from 1989, introducing us to Super Mario Bros. 3, and then the movie in 1993, and then the video game and everything else. So yeah, even Super Mario Odyssey has undeniable references to that original 8-bit Mario game. And every Mario game since. Same with Zelda. Every time even when we create a new Zelda, an open world Zelda, they always throw in little Easter eggs to that original 8-bit game. They always do, because they know that's what people expect. And honestly, even though it's in 3D and the graphics are better and it's full HD now, Zelda is still the same game it was in 1986. It's still the same game. More or less. It's exploring an open world. It's grinding through dungeons in more or less the correct order. Fairly linear game. I know Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are less linear than their predecessors, but for the most part, the Zelda formula has remained largely intact. More so than it hasn't. Because those 2 games that I just mentioned are the exception. Because you still have a link between worlds and everything else that is set in the very linear, top-down Zelda-esque original style. Even when you look into the 3D games like Ocarina of Time and Twilight Princess, those are still 3D reinterpretations of the original Zelda. Again, with obvious references and Easter eggs to that original 8-bit game anyways. But the 8-bit game still remains insanely popular today, even among young kids. Whether they're buying the original cartridges to play on original hardware, they're buying retro clones, they're emulating it, or they're playing it on Nintendo Switch Online. That 1980, 86, 87, years get muddy when you're talking different regions. But that late 80s Zelda game is still our core definition of what we think of when we think of Zelda. Even with the success of Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild, or Twilight Princess, you say the Legend of Zelda, and you immediately picture the 8-bit Zelda game, and then other images slowly start to pop in your brain. Alright, I've set the stage and I've laid out my premise. We're obsessed with 80s culture in particular. I've given you some examples and some evidence of this. Now, is it bad? That was the question I asked at the very start of this video and in the topic's title. Is retro collecting bad? And I'm not going to give you a definitive answer at this exact moment, but as I progress, and this is going to be a long video, by the way, 45 minutes minimum. Bear with me, please. I'm going to make a point. But the point is, retro collecting is very heavily influenced by the 80s. I know there are people that collect things from the 2000s, but the things from the 2000s are still references to the things from the 80s, by and large. I know there are some exceptions, Grand Theft Auto, Resident Evil, Final Fantasy. Uh-oh! Final Fantasy goes back to the 8-bit Nintendo. Uh-oh. But it is what it is. I apologize. My nose is stuffy. I'm doing the best I can. Anyways. But we haven't even had 6 Grand Theft Autos yet. Unless you count the spin-offs and side quests. We had 6 Mario games before 1996. Before Mario was a decade old, we had 6 Mario games. We had 6 Zelda games before there was a PlayStation 2. Zelda 2, Zelda A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening DX, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and the 3 games on the CDI. To name a few. That's 8 games before we even had a Dreamcast. And all of them heavily inspired by or influenced by the original, which is itself kind of sort of an evolution of previous games, Adventure, Dungeons and Dragons, etc. Even a little bit of Pitfall in there for good measure. Yes, not the Mayan Adventure, but the original Pitfall on the Atari 2600, the one that Activision made back in the day when they were still, relevant, I will say. But anyways, now you could argue, well, we've had annual releases of Madden and Call of Duty, etc. Madden goes back to the 80s. The first Madden was 1989. Call of Duty, I'll give you that, but Call of Duty is just kind of sort of an evolution of the first-person shooter genre, which didn't originate until the 90s, so that's a separate thing. I'll give you that. That is an evolution. But nobody's collecting Call of Duty shit. Nobody's out there wearing Call of Duty t-shirts with Call of Duty coffee mugs, and Call of Duty knickknacks on their, on their kitchen counter and Call of Duty keychains. Mario, Zelda, Pac-Man, oh yes they are. All day long. But that's, again, neither here nor there. But what's the impact this obsession with the 80s has had? Well, for one, it has stagnated creativity. We see this in Hollywood. Beetlejuice, The Flash, Indiana Jones and the Who Gives a Fuck. All we're doing is just making throwbacks to the 80s. Even that Top Gun movie that was a big hit a few years ago. All we're doing is obsessively trying our hardest to recreate the 80s as thoroughly as possible. Lisa Frankenstein came out earlier this year. Big hit. Smash hit with the horror community. Nothing but an 80s throwback. Not a bad movie. I've talked about it on my other channel, Horror Trans. Go check it out. But we're obsessed with the 80s. So much so that we had a sitcom that was nothing but throwbacks to the 80s. Remember the Goldbergs, 1980-something? I just did a video on it last week. Yeah, we're obsessed with the 80s. But aside from stifling creativity, which it very much, absolutely, undeniably has done, what are the other impacts that it has had? Well, let's talk about the video games for a second, because I've already given you examples of toys, right? Video games, right? So we're so obsessed with keeping the 80s video games alive that we have a whole consumer base, a whole industry around recreating the 80s hardware, whether it be through emulation, in retro clones, or FPGA, or whatever, or some combination thereof. Nearly every retro clone automatically, by default, will play NES cartridges. That is mandatory step one. Step one is to be considered a retro clone. It almost universally has to play 8-bit NES games. That is like bullet point checklist number one. And then anything else goes above and beyond that. N64, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, etc. But the default is recreating the ability to play 8-bit NES games. That is standard nearly across the board. There are more 8-bit NES emulators than any other system. There are at least 30 NES dedicated or emulators that can also emulate NES among other systems. Too many choices when it comes to NES emulators. Some systems have no emulation to speak of that's functional, or if they have any emulation at all, it's either incorporated into the multi-systems like MAME, previously MES, or just a single emulator a lot of times. So there's a lot of game systems that nobody gives a shit about emulating. But I'll be damned, and so will you, if we don't make damn sure that you can play 8-bit Mario and Zelda and Donkey Kong on anything that can run electricity. Because we damn well do. Because we damn well have already. And we've been emulating 8-bit NES games pretty much since 8-bit NES games were still on the market. We've been obsessed with this 8-bit 80s NES culture since the 80s, and I don't see it dying anytime soon. But that's only one aspect of it, right? The bankrupt creativity. Well, we're seeing that in Hollywood, we're seeing that in fashion, we're seeing that in toys. I've already given examples. You know, G.I. Joe is stuck in the 80s. Masters of the Universe stuck in the 80s. Star Wars, more or less, stuck in the 80s. Well, some 70s. But also, Star Wars has made an attempt to branch out, but to various degrees of success. And occasionally you'll get something like Fortnite or Minecraft or, you know, Pokemon that breaks through. But for the most part, it's even the Super Mario toys, right? Most of them are based on the 8-bit games, right? You got Goombas and Koopa Troopas and, you know, Boos and things like that. You occasionally get something from one of the newer games, but more often than not, it's something from the 8-bit era. I would say the same with Sonic, but he came out in the 90s. But he's still lumped into this retro culture, because like I said, it kind of extends all the way up to about 95, 96. That's the bridge. Going forward, we start to get into more modern culture, more modern things, but even then, we're still seeing a lot of throwbacks. You know, again, you'll occasionally get something like Resident Evil, or The Matrix, or The Lord of the Rings crossover into the mainstream. But everything else is as tied to the 80s as it can get. Even The Matrix is kind of tied to the 80s because it's sort of a retelling of the Terminator story. Kind of. Sort of. But it is what it is. So, what are some other impacts we've had? Well, you were waiting for me to bring up thrift stores, right? You knew I was going to bring up thrift stores. Once upon a time, in the years yonder past, you could walk into a thrift store and they would have a wall of video game shit. A whole wall of video game shit. And a whole nother wall on the other side of the store of toys. And you could very easily find 80s action figures on any of those walls. You could find McDonald's toys. You could find Transformers, G.I. Joes, all day long. You never had to look. If this thrift store didn't have them, the one across town did. All day long. Same thing with video games. I could walk into any random thrift store in the country and buy an NES cartridge. All day long. This was just assumed it was going to be there. But then our obsession with collecting led us to eBay and online buying, and this led us to the resellers, aka the scalpers. Those who went on the hunt to scoop up all the games they could find from the thrift stores and the yard sales and the flea markets, shove them in a closet somewhere, and let them trickle out over time on eBay because they were controlling the market, because they had access to the supply, and they could control what was available. Despite there being massive demand, they could demand higher prices because people are like, well, there's not as many of them available. There are, but there are forces in the market controlling access to the supply artificially. And that is a bad thing. People talk about all day long how retro game collecting is expensive. Well, the reason it's expensive is because you had a game that sold 30 million copies. There should presumably be 30 million units available to purchase, but there's not. You might be lucky to find 500 or 600 units available to purchase of any given software, regardless of how well it sold. Because the scalpers are hoarding all the copies to control the price, to control the supply. That's a bad thing. But then you also have the flip side of that. You have the, shall we say, bootleggers and the knockoffs. Those who are willing to recreate these things from the past to sell to either those who are gullible and don't know the difference between an authentic original and a reproduction, or those who don't care. Now, in some cases, they'll make it very obvious, hey, this is a reproduction, and they'll sell it accordingly to the price and the market is willing to pay. Otherwise, they'll use deceptive tactics to try to convince you it's an authentic original so they can get more for it than it's worth, because they're evil people, as are the scalpers and the resellers. And yes, if you own a video game store, I'm calling you a scalper, because that's what you are. Because you are controlling the supply. You're a bad person. I don't care. Kelsey Lewin, you're a bad person. Metal Jesus, you're a bad person. John Riggs, I'm sorry to say, John Hancock, you're all bad people. That's my opinion. You can't convince me otherwise. Because you are hoarding games and keeping them out of the market to control the prices to benefit yourselves. That is the very definition of selfish, and selfish is another word for evil. It is what it is. In some circles. Your perspective may vary, but that's how I feel about it. You're not going to convince me otherwise. I've interviewed John Hancock previously. I did a whole interview with him on a previous podcast and wrote an article about him on my blog. He's not a nice guy. I'll give you that. I'll give you that for free. So there you go. He's kind of a jerk. I'll give you that one for free. But it is what it is. All right. The other negative impact this obsession is having on our culture is it is fostering this obsession with original hardware, right? And there are bullies, and I will call you a bully if you do this, who will tell people that they're not real gamers or real retro collectors if they don't own physical cartridges and physical machines and CRT televisions. Those people are assholes. Because they put an unrealistic expectation on people who don't have the financial resources to be able to obtain those things and make them feel guilty and bad about themselves. Shame on you. If somebody can't afford to buy a CRT, which they're expensive, by the way, a functional one, and heavy, and take up a lot of space, and an original NES, and original cartridges, They shouldn't be shamed for it if they're going to play their games on a RetroPie, or the Nintendo Switch, or their laptop, or their fucking mobile phone. Don't shame people for accessing the games in the method that they are available to them. Okay? So let's knock that shit off. But this has, combined with other elements of toxic fandom, escalated into where we have very heated debates, which usually turn into arguments, which usually end in yelling and name-calling, where people get very heated over the true collectors and the posers, I guess. I don't know. Hipsters. I don't know what word people use these days. This is bad. This is bad news bears. It's the same as those people that say you have to spend $35,000 on an original issue of X-Men from 1962, or it doesn't count. If you buy a reprint, it doesn't count. If you buy a trade paper... a trade paperback or a graphic novel that collects those stories into an accessible form, it doesn't count. Or if you buy digital comics or collect digital comics, I don't care how you obtain them, by the way, it doesn't count. Those people are assholes too. They can eat shit. They can go eat their grandmother's asshole for all I care, and if she's lying in a grave, go eat her corpse's asshole. I don't give a shit. Stop being a dick. Now, this is not a digital versus physical debate, because I have a massive digital collection of video games and comic books and movies. But I also have a massive physical collection of toys and comics and video games and movies as well. We're not debating that. It's do what you have the means to do. Enjoy life. You only get to live once. Don't let other people tell you how to live. Just live your life. On that note, if you want to play Harry Potter video games and eat at Chick-fil-A, do it. I'm not going to tell you not to. If that's what gives you joy out of life, do it. Don't let the haters hate on you, because they're bitter people. And I'm saying this as a trans woman. I'm giving you permission to like Harry Potter. And if somebody comes at me, fuck you. You know? I'm not naming names or calling people out, but a lot of the big trans women on Twitter have already blocked me because of this stance, and I'm not going to change. Like what you like. Because it doesn't matter. You're not going to change JK's opinion. She's going to be a TERF. There's nothing you can do to change it. Denying yourself pleasures because she's a scumbag is stupid, and you're an idiot if you do that. You are an idiot if you do that. If you used to like Harry Potter, and today you don't because J.K. Rowling is a bitch, you're an idiot. Flat out cold turkey. Stop being an idiot. Enjoy life, and fuck her. Who cares what she says on Twitter? Fuck her. And fuck you. Let people like what they like. I personally will not eat at Chick-fil-A. But if somebody else tells me they're going there, I'm not gonna give them shit over it. Like what you like. Do what makes you gives your life meaning and pleasure. You only get to live one time. Okay? So, that is more or less the points I wanted to make. You know, things are turning toxic with our fandom, and we have a lot of scalpers that are artificially manipulating the prices and availability of things, and our obsession with this particular time period has stifled creativity. These are all negatives. So is retro collecting bad? No, not at all. But the obsession with retro collecting that has led to negative things can be considered bad. What is the solution? Do what works for you. If you have to pirate games, pirate games. Don't feel guilty. That's all I got. Stay cool.